Today's horror story is written by Dark Hero. This is something that happened to me 10 years ago. Now, take this as you will, but what you're about to hear is something I can barely explain myself. Nonetheless, it's something I wish to be told, so bear with me. Just some backstory. My name is Ray, and I was and still am a freelance photographer. I was in my 30s, and I was living in New York around that time when I got a call from a Mr. Peters, who said that he was the executor of my father's will. I wanted to hang up right then and there, but this man was just doing his job despite the fact that it was for my father. My father was the darkest part of my life. In fact, my biggest regret is that I waited till I was 18 to finally escape him. Growing up, I only saw him as someone full of anger and liquor who couldn't keep his fists to himself. My mother had left us when I was around 6 years old, and of course that made everything much worse. I would go to school trying my best to hide the cuts and bruises from the night before, and I'd go home for it to happen again. He was meticulous, as he was terrifying. No one would ever know what he did to me, and I was too afraid to do anything about it. As I got older, I became more resilient as he got weaker. Years of cigarettes and alcohol had caught up with him, so he switched to more emotional abuse, saying that it was my fault that my mom had left. I tried my best not to let his words faze me, but it hurt to hear something like that from my own father. And the doubt and depression he had planted in me, I'd rather have him hit me. Despite his abuse, I tried my hardest in my studies, and when I was finally old enough, I went off to college. I took care of everything myself, and I never looked back. My father had passed away, and as previously stated, Mr. Peters was distributing his assets. He didn't have much, but he had left me a cabin that had been in our family for decades. I was quite taken aback. I haven't talked to him in over 12 years. I absolutely refused to go to his funeral, but hearing that he actually put me in his will, I was surprised he actually thought of me despite everything that had happened. I thought about it for a moment, but eventually agreed to take it. Worst case scenario, I could sell it, and that would be the last part of him I could get rid of. The cabin was deep in the forests of Pennsylvania. I had packed enough for a week and went about it as a mission. I would go to the cabin to check the state that it was in and decide what I should do with it. Maybe get a few nature shots in while I was at it. If I decided to sell, great. If by some chance I wanted to keep it, I guess it wouldn't be that bad. It was a few hours' drive from where I was at, and on the way over my arms and legs began to ache as I thought about my father. He hadn't been on my mind for so long, but as I drove in silence on that long stretch of empty road, memories of him began to flood in. I wish I could say I was happy when I heard the news of his passing. I wish I could say that I felt absolutely nothing at all. But when I heard that he had finally passed, well, I'd be lying if I said my heart didn't ache a bit. He wasn't always horrible. There were blue moon moments when he was sober and kind, but that doesn't excuse what he had done. I shook the thoughts from my head and continued the next couple hours of the drive. When I finally reached the forest, I followed a worn and winding path towards my father's cabin. The skies were filled with dark gray clouds, making the scenery around me look so foreboding. My father used to take me and my mother up here every now and then when he had time off work. He insisted that the fresh air would help my mom, and being out in nature would help me man up. It was early afternoon when I finally pulled into the cabin. It was almost exactly as I remembered it, though a bit more weathered and aged. As I got out of my car and walked towards the front porch, an antique rocking chair creaked back and forth, while the chill of the autumn air made me shiver. I had to push a shoulder into the door as I opened it. The old wood swung open with more force than intended, and I stumbled inside. I was absolutely awestruck as I stood in the entryway. Looking around the interior of the old cabin, I noticed that it was completely unchanged. As if the last time I was there, time had paused until I returned. The sofa, the decorations, the television, everything was where I remembered it. I walked to the dining room table next to the kitchen and brushed my hand over its smooth surface. Not a speck of dust. Did my father come up here recently? He was never the type of person who would clean after himself. His home was filled with empty bottles and cigarette butts. I didn't think anything of it. I was thankful I didn't have much to clean up. I slumped into the old floral sofa. My body sank into the cushions. I thought about what I was doing there. I'm not sure why, but I felt a need to come back to this place. The cabin held a lot of memories. It contained history that long surpassed me. My father was so proud to tell us that his great-great-grandfather had built this place with his own 2 hands. Every head of the house would come and fix it up and whatnot throughout the years. I scoffed as I thought about his damn smirk, the same that's placed on my own face. I closed my eyes. The drive must have taken more out of me than I thought. I tilted my head back and began to drift into short rest. I tried to relax as I took a deep breath of cold, fresh air. I exhaled, or rather, tried to exhale. I couldn't let the air out, no matter how hard I tried. I felt my throat begin to constrict as if someone was pressing their hands onto them. Tried to move and thrash to try and get up, but my body wouldn't budge. My heart raced as I suffocated. And as suddenly as it came, I shot up from the couch and gasped in oxygen. I placed a hand onto my throat and felt nothing out of the ordinary. Did I just have a nightmare mixed with some kind of sleep paralysis? I glanced at my watch. A few hours had passed since I got here. I sat back onto the couch and wiped some sweat from my brow. That nightmare really shook me to my core. I looked down and saw my hands were trembling. I gripped them tightly to stop the shaking. I rushed towards the bathroom in the hallway and turned on the hot water at the sink. I watched the steam rise from the water and splashed a handful onto my face. I caught my reflection in the mirror and saw my eyes were pink, and I looked at my neck to see deep purple bruises. 5 small oval bruises were on my neck, 1 on my right side and 4 on my left. I lifted my neck to further inspect them, and sure enough, it looked like fingertips were gripped onto my throat. I turned the faucet off and rushed out of the bathroom. I leaned onto the nearest wall to steady myself as a wave of anxiety fell upon me. Memories of my father flashed into my mind, images of him hitting me and choking me as a child. I took deep breaths while holding my throat, completely afraid of something other than me grasping it. A few minutes had passed until I was fully able to catch my breath. I looked at the bathroom mirror again, and the bruises were still there. Where did they come from? I was sure I was the only one here. Of course I was the only one here. I was going to be here for a few days. I couldn't allow myself to be spooked over something. I felt sick to my stomach, so I didn't want to eat anything. I walked around through the hallway towards the bedrooms. The cabin was small, with only 2 beds and 1 bathroom, but it was cozy enough. Past the bathroom was a door to the right. I opened it to reveal a small boy's room. There were no decorations, just a twin bed, a dresser, and a desk. A loud thud emanated from the other bedroom, my parents' bedroom. I quickly stepped to it and opened the door to reveal a room with 2 separate beds and a large dresser. It was as bare as mine. I looked around to find what made the noise, but couldn't find a trace of anything. The room felt so cold goosebumps began to cover my arms, my breath visible as I exhaled, and I saw that a window was wide open. I crept towards the window and placed my hands on it to close it, when I noticed something deep within the woods. The figure was peeking from behind a tree. Its neck was completely bent over to an L shape, and it had long, wild hair that hung down. I kept my eyes focused on it, and I held in a scream. It wasn't moving. It just hung its neck in that bent position as its hair swayed in the wind. Were they lost and needed help? Surely they could see me looking out at them. I gathered some courage and called out to them. "Hello? Are you lost or something?" I yelled. They didn't respond, but before I could ask them something else, they slowly sank behind the tree. I'd be lying if I said that didn't unsettle me, but I just locked the windows and double-checked all the doors. And I just pushed it into the corner of my mind, thinking it was just someone being a creep. I was getting tired. The time had flown by and night fell upon me in the cabin. I slept into my old childhood bedroom. The sofa in my parents' bedroom were out of the question. I lied on the lumpy twin bed and looked out the window. There was no light whatsoever, and it was so quiet. I closed my eyes tightly, trying to drift to sleep, but I felt so uncomfortable. That's when I heard something making a clicking sound. I looked towards the direction of my window, and I heard it slowly opening. The sound of wood scraping pierced the silence of the night, and I jolted up. "Who's there?" I called out into the darkness, and I heard a low, cracked inhale from beyond the window. Whatever it was outside exhaled, and as it did, I could hear something breaking, like someone cracking a bundle of twigs. I didn't know what else to do. The only options I had were to run or fight, so I jumped off the bed and ran towards the front door. I had left the keys on the dining room table, so I could do everything in one swift motion. I had ran right out of the room and made a direct shot towards the keys, but they were gone. I heard something thudding behind me, and I saw the figure again. I turned to see the figure peering at me with its bent head from behind the entryway of my bedroom. Its hair slumped down. It was close enough that, despite being consumed by shadow, I could make out its thin, womanly figure. My hand slowly came around from the doorway and it clutched onto the wooden walls of the cabin. Its arms were long and had multiple joints in them that popped as it reached towards me. Its hands had long fingertips that ended with broken pieces of nail. I fell backwards onto my ass as the figure's hand swiped at me. I shuffled backwards while keeping my eyes on it. My body began to ache as I looked at my arms as welts, cuts, and bruises began to form all around them. The welts swelled to burst. Blood began to pour from them. I gave out a scream as the injuries began to spread from my arms to my torso to my legs. I felt some bones within me bend and break as I lay crippled on the floor. Flashes of my father's face appeared in my vision, and I began to convulse. Blood flooded inside my mouth, and I began to choke. I tried my best to split the blood out, but more and more began to drown me from the inside out. The figure was on the floor now. It used its long arms and fingernails to scratch the wooden floor and creep its way towards me. That was when I finally noticed her face. I could finally see her hair part from her bent neck as it dragged onto the floor. Her face was swollen, bruised, and bloodied. I could see the imprints of a hand on her neck, and I could finally see the face of my mother that I hadn't seen in so long. She had one eye that was visible. It was completely bloodshot, but it wasn't staring at me. I slowly tilted my head upwards to see a large, shadowy figure that loomed over me. It had its grip on my neck, and it felt so angry and malicious. I pushed through the pain on my body, the pain within me as well as I thrashed about. I looked towards my mother, and she reached a broken hand towards me. I picked myself up but slumped onto my knees. The shadowy figure was still over me. I didn't know what else to do but yell, "Leave us alone, you fucking monster!" And I heard it fucking laugh. It sounded so inhuman, but at the same time it was familiar. It was my father's laugh. So I knelt there and shouted at it. I let it know how much of a monster it was. I told him how fucked up he was for doing what he did. All the while, spit and blood splattered from my mouth. I was never really over him. I could never erase him, but he still stood in front of me while I stood between him and my mother. I shouted and cried until morning finally came, and when the sunlight crept through the windows, I realized that they were both gone. I finally let everything go and I crashed into the floor again. I fell unconscious. I fell into a deep sleep, and when I awoke, there was still a bit of light creeping through. I picked up the pieces of myself that were left. I was beaten and bloodied, but I had another urge. Something was calling me. I decided to grab my camera and step outside to take some pictures of the scenery. Whenever I take pictures, it always puts me in the present. I'm able to forget about everything and focus on the here and now. I stepped outside and got my digital camera ready. The sound of leaves crunching underneath me filled me with nostalgia. As a kid, I would rush into the woods and pretend I was an explorer. That's when I remembered something from when I was a kid. I looked around the trees to find a specific one. It was close to the cabin, and I'm sure it was still here. It took me a minute to remember where it was from my memory, but I eventually found a tree with Ray sloppily carved into it. I lifted my camera to focus a shot and snapped a photo. I looked at the small screen and almost dropped my camera. Thankfully, it was around my neck. The photo showed the small, thin tree with the carving, and on the sides were gray-blue fingertips gripped onto the wood. I shot my attention to the tree. I even walked around it, but nothing. I went to the base of the tree, and with my bare and bloodied hands, I began to dig. It took hours, and night came again, but I was in a trance. I didn't want to stop digging. I was sure I'd broken some fingers, but I finally felt something smooth deep within the dirt. I took my phone and flashed the light upon a skull. I uncovered the rest and sobbed deeply. I sobbed because I was right, and my mother didn't leave me. I called the police, and they came with an ambulance. They were shocked to see the state I was in, but I just wanted some medical attention. I didn't return to that cabin for a month, and when I did, I came back with a priest who said he would bless the old place. The cabin had a lot of history, and a dark history. But afterwards, it felt a bit lighter. Now, to the present day, it's been years later, and I have a son of my own. One day I'll take him up to the family cabin and fill it with happiness, giving that dark history a bright future. Thank you for listening. You can probably handle another horror story, right?